Hello, and welcome to Being Jewish or Being Messianic. Today, we have kind of an unusual topic. We have been studying the temples. And first, we looked at the tabernacle, and then we had looked at the first temple. And as we were discussing the tabernacle and the first temple, we focused on the details. And Moses, when he did the tabernacle, and David and Solomon, when they were planning and then building the first temple, there was really a passion to honor God, and focus was to listen to him. And and the scriptures provided so many details and so much insight into why things were done this way and what they were. There were so many wonderful messages from the Lord. And as the builders were building the tabernacle and the first temple, there really was a focus on the Lord. Well, we have had a second temple, and there's a little bit of a difference between the that temple, Herod's, what's commonly referred to as Herod's temple, and the tabernacle and the first temple and it. So we're kind of going to go through this just briefly, what we've already kind of recap of what we looked at. So we know that Moses was given guidance from God on the Mount Sinai how to build the tabernacle. The precious metals, the linen, the resources were all things that came from Egypt and then were used to build the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant. So the first temple that I mentioned is commonly called Solomon's temple. It was built by Solomon in the 10th century BCE, and it was the first permanent temple in Jerusalem, and it housed the Ark of the Covenant. It was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BCE. Today we're going to be looking at the second temple. And it was built after the return of the Babylonian exile in the late 6th century BCE, and it was a more modest structure at first than Solomon's temple. Later, it became expanded and renovated by Herod the Great. And that's why we call it Herod's temple. He didn't actually build the first part of it, but he built onto it and remodeled it. And so that's kind of where we're going with this. The one other thing I really wanted to talk about is, and can you see the Being Jewish screen? You can just type in the
Yes.
center. Thank you. Okay. The other thing about this is the ark. So we know that the ark first appeared in the Bible during the time of Moses around 1500 BC, somewhere in there, after the Israelites had left Egypt and we had the parting of the Red Sea and they were at the Mount. And we know that in Exodus 25:10, God commanded Moses to make an ark of acacia wood. We also know it was captured by the Philistines when they took it in the battlefield. The Israelites decided to have the favor of God and took the ark into the battlefield. They weren't told to do that, and the Philistines were able to then capture it. The Philistines held on to it for about 7 months. And one of the things that kept happening was that they put it near where they put it in their own temple, and the gods, the little statue gods that they had, kept falling over. And finally, they were destroyed by being in the same area. So they realized they also had a lot of other plagues and different things going on, and they realized that they needed to give the ark back to the Israelites, which they did. We know that King Josiah returned the ark to the temple when it was removed, and we know that from Second Chronicles chapters 33, 34, and Second Kings chapter 21 through 23. The last mention of the ark is in Second Chronicles chapter 35, where King Josiah asked the Levites to return it to the temple. It wasn't being stored in the temple where it was supposed to be. And it's believed that it disappeared during the Babylonian sacking of Jerusalem in 586. So there's a lot of that. The other thing I want to cover before we move on today is hitting about the construction, or excuse me, the number of people in the time of Solomon and time in Jesus' time, because now we're focusing on Jesus's time today. So we know in Solomon's time, in the 10th century BCE, there's different estimates. They think probably around 1 million. And when I was giving figures last week, that's kind of where we were going to those. The problem was there were a lot of people that had already been exiled and come back. And so there's different things in those different time periods. In the first century CE, in Jesus' time, they estimates completely vary on how many people, that they think there were about 4 to 8 million. That includes the Jews living in Judea and then the diaspora. They were dispersed around. So there's a lot of differences of the people at the time, and there was a lot of difference in the way the two temples were built. And that's one of the things we have to really think about. What was the focus of the people when they were building the temples? So we're going to be getting into that today. So let's just kind of look at the construction sizes. Solomon's temple, like I said, was built by Solomon, and it was the first temple. It was a pretty small structure when you look at this picture. And then Herod's temple, it was a massive expansion and renovation of the second temple, which was also a very modern, modest replacement of Solomon's temple. Herod's temple was really renowned for its grandeur and size. It covered a much larger area and featured an impressive courtyards and structures. And again, we don't have exact measurements or well, we have some measurements, but we don't have exact details on a lot of things. So as we go through, again, I'll just have pictures of artist renditions, but I can't tell you exactly what everything looks like. So again, it's very different in the size, and you can see the different aspects of it. And this is why I like it. And we'll be kind of going into some of the different areas of Herod's temple. So Solomon's temple, we know it stood for about 400 years. Before being destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BCE. Herod's temple stood for about 500 years. And that includes the start of the second temple to when Herod remodeled it and it became Herod's temple. Solomon's temple, we know that we have a lot of, remember, I've read a lot of the details about it. Some of the ornaments on the outside and things, they're very debated. So there's a little bit of debate about it. Herod's temple, though, was very Hellenistic and Roman architectural styles. It reflected the influence of the prevailing culture during his reign, and he wanted it to be very Roman. And the significance of all of that is Solomon's temple, again, we've talked about there was more of a religious and there was more of a seeking God, and the Ark of the Covenant was there. It was the most sacred object in all of Judea. In Herod's temple, we didn't have the ark. It's still missing. It had disappeared by then, but it still was the place of worship that everybody went to in the pilgrimage. So the other thing about this is Solomon's temple represented the peak of uniting the kingdom of Israel under Solomon. Herod's temple, it was built during a period of Roman rule and reflected his efforts to appease his Jewish subjects and enhance his image to the Romans. So while they both were central places of worship, there was definitely a difference in the style and the architectural style itself, but also the motives and the feeling of it. So that got me to thinking about Jesus and the money changers. So we know in Matthew 21:12-13, he went into the temple area, the whole temple enclosure, and drove out all those who bought and sold in the sacred place. He turned over the four-footed tables of money changers and the chairs of those who sold doves. He said to them, the scripture says, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers. And also in Mark 11, the same story. And they came to Jerusalem. So we see that he actually kicks them out of them, and he actually calls them den of robbers. And when the chief priest, so if you go down to verse 18 here, the chief priests and scribes heard this, kept seeking ways to destroy him, for they feared him, because the entire multitude was struck with astonishment at his teaching. So today we're going to be focusing on why that's so important, because that's what really struck me as I was looking at Herod's temple. What does this mean? And when I always thought about Herod's temple, I never really realized the scale. And today that's where we're kind of going to the scale of all of this, is what was the scale, what was impacting. There's a lot there. And the other thing that really occurred to me is there was a Roman fortress on the Temple Mount. And that is a little unusual in itself because this is a rural agricultural area. Why were the Romans so interested in being there? What was going on? Why would the Romans want to have a garrison on the Temple Mount to track things? Well, there's a reason. Last week I talked about the sacrifices. So there's daily sacrifices, including the lamb's offerings in the morning and evening, the Sabbath sacrifices that were made on the Sabbath, the monthly offerings, the festival offerings like Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, Feast of Weeks, Day of Atonement, Feast of Tabernacles, and each one of these has the things that they needed. So, as I said last week, it's a little hard to get a precise number of animal sacrifices, but we know there were at least tens of thousands of animals every year that were sacrificed. So then that got me thinking about you only really needed the blood. And we know that some of the meat went to the priest, and that's was their some of their payment. What did they do with the rest of it though? And then I started doing some research on that. Animal skins. For the first thing, animal skins. The priest would typically perform the skinning of the animals. Then we do know from some archaeological digs and some different references that the hides would processed in some way. So there's probably tanning them and turning them into leather, which there was a lot of uses for leather at the time. They had leather garments for warmth and durability. We know the Romans wore a lot of leather. Containers used to make bags, water bags, and other containers. Animal hides were also used to make the scrolls. And it had to be from a kosher animal. So it makes sense that the priest would have been using some of the hides for scrolls. And leather was used in a lot of ways. So there was big economic significance for those. And that's what got me started on this because you would have been selling those to tanners and craftspeople who could then process them into leather. Or maybe we don't have any records of this, or they themselves could have been hiring the people to do that. It could be either way. But we do know from archaeological excavations that there were tanneries and leather workshops around the Temple Mount. So we do know that and throughout the city. So while there's not necessarily a direct link to the temple sacrifices, it's very reasonable to assume there were some of these things being done. And that's why this is important because we do know there's so many animals sacrificed that they wouldn't have wasted it. Jews typically don't waste things. They tend to be a very practical and frugal people, and this would not have gone to waste. So they used it in some way. And a lot of the things that I'm going to be sharing are things that we're having to assume, but it gives you an idea. And this is where the Lord has kind of drawn me into it to give me a better understanding of this. But again, these are going to be assumptions on the numbers. So again, on assumptions, we're just going to assume 50,000 to 100,000 animals were sacrificed annually. That's going to be a really conservative based upon things that we do know from writings of the time. But I wanted to go super conservative on this so that we have more of a better idea. When you're skinning animals, it's also possible that even though you're an expert at it, you could have some hides that just you didn't cut them right or something. So we're only going to call 75% of these hides. And so the average hide is about 5 square feet. It's a rough estimate, and it depends upon the type of animal, but we'll call it that. So just on these, you can see we're running anywhere from 200,000 to 350,000 square feet of leather. And again, I'm trying to go with low balling. So if you are trying to figure this out yourself, you probably will come up with a higher number, but I wanted to go low ball. So just in Jesus' time, we know that there were hundreds of thousands of square feet of leather produced. And this would have been a valuable resource at the time. So what was the value? It's very hard to estimate the value at the time. So I've had to use some comparisons to what it would be the cost for today to help us get a better understanding. And these are best guess because remember, the value of money back then was a little bit different. So we also don't know how much some of these things sold for. There's no way to know. So as you can see, we could be talking $1 million to $3.5 million. That's just a best guess. So Just, it's a very rough estimate. But again, we're kind of looking at the whole idea of this. So then we've assumed that the value. Remember last week I talked about that they used the blood for fertilizer. We already know that. We do know that because there's references for this. And then there's the meat. Well, we know that a lot of the meat went to the priest, but there still would have been quite a bit left over. So let's assume that only 20% of all the animals slaughtered were sold. It probably was much higher, but again, I don't know. And when you see how many people were working in the temple, you'll see why I'm not sure about that. We also know that there was showbread and other breads that were made. And we know there was bakeries there because of the excavations. There probably was bread being sold too from the looks of it, because you would have sold pastries or things like that in the courtyard to people that were coming, and that would have been very common. We know from the money changers things that was probably happening. So then I started thinking about animal byproducts, and they would have some value. We do know there was a lot of oil and wine, and that's actually probably a really low estimate, but it's just a good idea. So already we're between 7 to 13 million. But there's more. Then I started thinking about, because I grew up on a farm, and I started thinking about tallow. And tallow would have been used a lot back then. Tallow is something you use for candle making, soap, lubricants, waterproofing. You're going to have a lot of it. And we know on average that about 20% of an animal's weight is fat. So with 5 to 10 million pounds of meat, that's 1 to 2 million pounds of fat. So if you do just a 50%, again, that's kind of low, yield of tallow from fat, you still have quite a bit. So we're still looking at another $1.2 million probably. But then they made scented soaps. We know that as well from other sources. And there's also, one of the things that other people really disliked about the Israelites was that they were very clean and they washed everything, and they kept things very clean and very pure. So we know they were making soap. And again, you would have had the tallow from that. So, and I'm dividing up the tallow for all of that. Well, this is already bringing, if you add the tallow to the other estimates, you're looking at $7 to $10 million. But wait, there's more. Then there's the money. Every Jewish male above the age of 20 had to pay an annual temple tax of a half shekel. Now, I brought that in early about estimating the Jewish population. It's difficult, but let's assume we'll stick with the 4 to 8 million, and perhaps half of those being over the age of 20. So let's talk about 2 to 4 million men paying the tax. Could be more, could be less, but it's a good starting place just to give us an estimate. Then the value of a half shekel is debated. So we're going to call it $5 to $10 because that's what most people believe it was probably worth about that time based upon our economy now. So it wasn't a lot, but they still had to pay it. So as you can see, just a low estimate, you're talking 12 million, 12.5 million, but you could be talking 60 million. So somewhere between total, best guess is probably 15 to 50 million in today's dollars. It's a guess. Again, it's a lot of money though, right? And that's one of the things you have to think about. There was a lot. The temple, we know, received substantial financial contributions for the Jewish people through the temple tax, but there were other offerings. So that's why I'm thinking this is a very low estimate. And this income supported the temple's operations, the priests, the Levites, and various religious and community activities. Even with the rough estimates, it's clear the temple was a major economic institute in ancient Judea. So then it made me think about how many people were working there. Well, the priest were the primary personnel responsible for the sacrifices, rituals, maintaining the temple's sanctity. We know they were divided in 24 courses or divisions, each serving for a week at a time, and they had specific duties. But even when the course of duty, not all the priests would be on duty at once, because you had people that were on at night, people that were on in the day. So there were different times they would rotate. So there was a lot of rotations, and each were trained with very specific assignments. So the best guess I could come up with, and by all the things I could find, was several hundred priests would be working at the temple on any given day. Now you have the Levites. They assisted the priest in various tasks, including maintaining the temple building and grounds. They performed music and singing in the temple and served as guards and gatekeepers. The best guess, several hundred or a few thousand Levites would be needed daily, depending upon the day and specific task. Keep in mind, on holidays, it's going to be a lot higher. The temple staff. There'd be a lot of personnel that would be working there. And it is possible, as long as they weren't in certain part, as long as they were Jewish, there could have some have been slaves, but probably not, but it is possible. The temple staff would included butchers, bakers, cleaners, maintenance workers, scribes, record keepers, the guards, watchmen, treasurers, and just administrators. So probably several hundred to 1,000 or so every day would be working there. This was a big operation. And then you also have support personnel. Beyond the core temple staff, we know that there were people like craftspeople, the tanners, the metal workers who maintained the temple equipment, and the merchants themselves who were selling the goods and services to the pilgrims. There was also construction workers, because there was also constant ongoing repairs and renovations. We know a lot of these things from other writings like Josephus and different people who have written about the time of the temple. So if you take all of these together, there would be, a best guess for a daily workforce on a normal day, not a holiday, but a normal day, we're looking at several thousand people. We could be between 2,000 to 5,000 people. And again, the holidays are going to be on the high end. So again, it's a super rough estimate. We're having to assume a lot of things, but looking at this and breaking it down, what writings we have and what we know about the time. So then I started thinking about salaries. And this is going to be the lowest guess of all of this probably, and a very rough one. But basing it upon modern equivalents and things, this is where we're getting these answers. So, you had 1,000 priests, and if they made $20,000, which of course is going to be a lot lower than the high priest would have made a lot more than that, then we're just going to call it that. And so you come up with 20 million, and you have the Levites. We go through each one of these, and all of these are just estimates. So again, we're looking at $50 to $70 million of what it would cost to have the temple being function. Again, it's a big corporation. It's a big business there. So, all of this is speculative, but it gives you an idea of the scale of this operation. So then, because I'm a kind of a numbers kind of person here, I wanted to look at how this came about. So more of a income and expenses and profit loss ratios. So I was coming up with the range of 15 to 50 million annually, the sales, the meat, 6 to 7 million annually. But then we're looking at the cost. So it'd be, as we said, between 50 to 70 million. All of these things come up to a profit or loss. And they probably had 10 million or more extra at the end of the year. And again, there's no precise figures. These are just ideas of what they would have been making. But it also made me realize this is why the Romans were so interested in them, because Rome usually didn't have a garrison in a small, in a agricultural area. So that's what really caught my attention with all of this. So let's talk about Rome. So Rome was taxing them. And Rome had various taxes, including land tax, head tax, custom tax, and they would have been taxing even the people that working in the temple. And all of the residents of Judea would have had some of these. So there would have been the tax from the temple income from all the people that were working there. There would have been a tax liability. Everyone would have been paying on their income and paying an annual fund. So there's no record of how much the Romans asked for in taxes, but we can get some ideas about it. There's also indirect taxation. So there's economic and land ownership, as I've talked about, but there's a lot of different ways that they were taxing them. We do know that the Roman tax system was on every place they were at, was a significant burden on the population there. And the temple and the staff there wouldn't have been exempt. They would have had to be paying something. We just don't know how much. But again, with that much money coming into the temple, I can see why the Romans were there. So let's just see how, just kind of a rough guess. And when I looked at it, just if you based upon assumptions about, we kind of know what the Romans taxed in some places, but not completely because it varied so much. But we're going to call it $6 to $9 million. That's a good reason for them to be there. A really good reason why the Romans didn't want anything changed. But there were some other things about it. Rome, besides the revenue, there was a lot of money, of course, that they were doing. They knew this was an economic hub, and they were seeing the pilgrims come in and out of there. Uh, they wanted to have stability in the region. So they like to, uh, they would allow different groups to have different religious beliefs and different things because they could still make it a stable area as long as it didn't pose a threat to them. They didn't care. So a prosperous temple meant less restless population, made it easy to govern that way. There was an indirect influence. It gave a political influence as to who was there as well and made decisions about the region. The religious leaders had some influence, obviously, going back and forth with the Romans. So there was a good hand in hand for them to have a reason to keep this and not let it change. There was a lot of reason for those in charge not to want things to change. And as I said, the Antonia Fortress, it was built onto the Temple Mount in the northwest corner. And it gave them control, security. They were up a high area. They could watch things. They could watch what was going on in the temple. Definitely, they could make sure they were getting their taxes. Now, they didn't actually collect the taxes, but they did often guard the tax collectors and make sure the tax collectors were giving them what they were supposed to. Having their fortress there was a huge symbol of power. It was a constant reminder for anybody that went to the temple, but it was definitely a protection for the Roman interest. It showed that they were there, they were going to be watching, and they had a huge presence. So, as we were looking at those numbers, is it possible there was temple greed? I'm going to go with yes. Jesus called them a den of vipers and he chased out the money changers. And I was really looking at how bad was this? So we had the temple tax, as I told you about. Then there was currency exchanges. This is the money changers. The pilgrims came to Jerusalem and they had to have a specific coin. So you had to pay to change your money into the coin. So there was profit and exploitation. We knew this. They also charged an exorbitant fee, and they were profiting significantly from the pilgrims' need to pay the temple tax. And that's one of the things that angered Jesus because it was an essential religious process that was being exploited for financial gain, and it turned the temple into a place from a place of worship into a marketplace. Religious purity. The temple was supposed to be considered a sacred place, and it became the center of commerce. So Jesus was getting rid of all of that to try to do this. And there's also, if you look at it, the social justice. They were exploiting the poor. One of the other things that I had found is this was something that people would bring their best dove or their best sheep. It had to be an unblemished sheep. It had to be unblemished animal. They would bring the best they had, and they would take it, and the merchants and the priest would look at it, and they would say, and that we know this happened, that they would say, this animal has a blemish. You'll have to buy one of ours. So then this poor person was having to buy a sheep from them, that sheep, and they would keep that sheep. And they would turn around and sell that same sheep that they said wasn't any good. They would sell it to another person. We do know that happened from some of the different things we've read in different writings that are out there. So it, what Jesus was doing, it wasn't about the money, but it was the sanctity. Remember, we talked about how Solomon and Moses, they had had a focus on the Lord. And This doesn't. This did not have it. And so Jesus had to cleanse the temple. It was a powerful statement against the power of abuse of power and the commercialization of the faith of the time. So then I thought about, how does that compare today? Are there money changer type things today? And first I was looking at like the banks. And that's kind of a good representation, but not totally. Interestingly, when I did some research on this, the common comparison would be payday loans, pawn shops, check cashing services, and ticket scalpers. And the reason is because the rate of interest and the rate of exchange that happens. Those would be, they're not religious, of course, but those would be very good examples, best I could find, for things that happen today because there's a fee that's involved, and sometimes it's a large fee. And the pawn shops, in the way I reconciled that one was because you're bringing your animals or you're bringing your goods that you were going to sacrifice, and you're having to change them and change in for money. And a ticket scalper, it's you're giving a particular item like a ticket, or maybe it was a shekel to get into the temple, and you're having to it mirrored that by the exchange of it. So you can see they're not perfect examples, but I needed to put it in my mind, I needed to put it into a good basis. So it kind of gives you an idea of how the cost of it. And I don't know if you've ever looked at check cashing or looked at the payday loans. There's a huge it's a lot of places have tried to make it illegal because it's pretty bad about the cost of the difference between what they charge, the interest. So then I started thinking about the corruption. So Solomon, first David had the idea to build the first temple, and the Lord said no because he'd been a man of war. So then Solomon built it. But when did it start? We know through the Bible that through history that the temple became corrupt at different times. And when did the corruption start? So we can't pinpoint an exact time it began, but probably it started really seeping in after Solomon's death, or it's even possible at the end of his life because he started allowing, when he started marrying so many women, he started allowing them to build temples in Jerusalem. There was idolatry, accumulation of wealth and power, and so that kind of set the stage for a lot of things. And we know there was a gradual decline. So there was periods of reform and renewal, but then there was periods of increased corruption where they were even sacrificing their own children. So the Old Testament prophets were constantly denouncing the priests and leaders for the greed, injustice, and neglect of their religious duties. So this was a very recurring theme. So some historical examples during the reign of King Josiah in the 7th century, it's notable because this is when he had a major reform. This is when he purged all the idolatry and restored the temple and asked that the ark be brought back. But there was such corruption that there had to be the widespread cleaning. And then the period after the return from the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BC saw a whole lot of problems maintaining the religious purity and avoiding the corruption. The books of Haggai and Malachi criticized the people and priests for their shortcomings. And then in Jesus' time, in the 1st century CE, we know in the Gospels that there was a very significant issues we've been talking about. So the money changers, the exploitation of pilgrims, the commercialization of the religious practices, all led to the decline in spiritual integrity. So I found that there were some key factors with the recurring. The reason there were so many times that this kept going is there was a concentration of power and wealth in the hands of the priestly families. It was always hereditary. Uh, it had to be because that's the only ones that could be the priest. And there was a temptation to exploit the religious practices for their personal gain. Then there were the challenges of maintaining their religious and moral standards over time. There would be reform, but then it went back because there wasn't a true calling to God and true coming to God. And the influence of the surrounding cultures and pressures of political and economic realities also played a part of that. And that's what we saw with Herod and the priest in Jesus' time, was they were looking at what the Romans thought. So there's a large part of this. So where does that bring us? the love of money. And what I got from all this was the corruption. And the way I saw it was like putting a few drops of dye or poison in a body of water, and it just spreads and runs to the entire body. We saw with the tabernacle and first temple, the focus was on God, and we have all these beautiful details from the Lord Himself. But then in Jesus' time, we saw something completely different with this temple. There was the greed, the pride, and the other sins had crept in. And by the time Jesus went in the temple, it really was a den of thieves and vipers, as He called them. We have several millions of reasons why they would not want Jesus' ministry to continue, why they wanted to have Him killed, because He was a threat to their economic and their political standings. And as we continue to look what happened to the Israelites, these lessons I felt like could really be applied to ourselves as well for not letting any sin take root in our life. A little sin or a little corruption doesn't stay little. It just spreads and saturates everything. And that's why it's so important with First Timothy 6:10, for the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people eager for money have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. And then Ecclesiastes 5:10, whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with their income. This too is meaningless. So for me, what I really got from looking at this, and like I said, these are estimates. This is just what I had based upon what I could find on all these things, truly estimates. But it really helped me understand why this is such a big thing and why Jesus was saying the things and why they went to such lengths, even though they knew many of them knew He was the Messiah, yet they still wouldn't recognize Him. And that always puzzled me. And as I started really researching and studying it, their greed and their all of the other things they had wouldn't allow them to see it. They didn't want to, even if they recognized it, they weren't willing to admit it. And that's where you get the hard-heartedness and the closed mind and closed heart. And I just hope this was interesting for you. And again, it's just estimates, so don't hold the estimates as gospel, because there's no real proof of the money, but it's kind of a reasoning of how I got to those. So next week we are going to be looking at Purim, and then on the 13th is actually Purim. And I also like this picture because it's a really good example of the gates. So now I'm going to open it up to ask the elders, what do you think of all of this and your thoughts? Henry.
Yes. Thank you so much for the presentation. I really appreciated the how you highlighted the greed aspect. That even though they knew who Jesus was, they still didn't want to let Him continue with his ministry, because of the fact that Jesus threatened their economic system, and because of their greed and their love for money. And so that is really a lesson that we need to continue to bear in mind, so we know that the love of money is indeed the root of all evil. So I'm grateful that you highlighted that. And I liked having seen the little coins as well. I know it's an estimate, but it's good to have a visual of what happened likely 2,000 years ago. So thank you.
Thanks, Henry. As I was studying this, the Lord kind of took me down a different route. This is not the presentation I originally thought I was going to do. I thought I was going to stick on to the how the temple was built and everything. But the Lord really put on my heart that we needed to look at the greed and understand where that comes from and see things the way He did. I mean, I don't have exact numbers, obviously, but it does really put it into perspective when you relate it to the fact that we're talking millions of dollars, what would be in our time. There's a really good reasons why they really didn't want Jesus to A lot of people believe Jesus was going to take political power. That's not what he said he was going to do, of course, but even to threaten them in any way. Ah, payday loans. I know someone that got caught up and had to get a lawyer to get out. They were only paying interest and not paying what was really borrowed. That's true, and that happens the same with all of those things with, the pawn shops and different areas that they do prey a lot of these prey upon the poor, and that's what was happening in the temple as well. They were preying on the poor people. And there really was a lot of corruption, and it's not just the Bible, we have other writings that tell a little bit about it. So there's definitely some corruption going on there. And I'm gonna open it up to questions and open up to anybody that has a comment they want to make. I did have a question about, music and books and things like that that are being sold in churches. Yes, I think that you're getting into that, and again, I'm just gonna stick with there's not a little corruption. When you let a sin in, you open a door, it really opens a door. I think every one of us can probably tell stories of that, that when you allow an open door, the enemy takes advantage of it. So, it is something that we have to be on guard for, and buying and selling God's things is not allowed. We know this very clearly. Any other questions or thoughts? Hmm. Would I
Gail.
say the higher okay, good, Vincent.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I never knew inflation was way back then. I didn't know how much money was going through there to look at. That's an awful lot of money that was going through. I never could imagine that it was that much. Thank you.
You know, there's one of the things that I always found interesting. When Jesus talks about the sound of the widow's mite and the sound of the person that's throwing the coins down, the reason he said that was they had these huge, they're trumpets or shofars, and they were shaped like a shofar, and it was this huge thing that you would put your money into so everybody could hear how much money you were, and it was shaming of you not to put more money in there. And that's where he was talking, there's the scripture about the widow's mite putting just a little bit in there because it made a tinkling sound. There was a lot of opulence, and it was a lot of things were covered with gold because there was a lot of money to be able to do that. So, and I had an interesting question. Would you say the hierarchy of England today is the same as the priest hierarchy of the Bible? Not exactly. Um, Not no, I mean, anytime you have a group of family who is in control and in power, there can always be problems and there can always be greed, and that's one of the things that happens. But there is this is yes and no. It's kind of like that, but it would also be well, it also be. I think you could also put a lot of this similar to what happens in Rome right now. Um, There's a lot of power and money there. And with spiritual influence, it's a little bit different. Shelley, you have your hand up.
So I have a question, Gail. So it seems like the first temple was, led by the Lord, like for the heart for the Lord, for serving the Lord. Then this Herod's temple, it seems like there was a mixing with the influence of the Roman style and different things like that. And like Herod, it was to please, for opulence and prideful things and things. And I just think that was like could that be, part of the downfall because the heart matter, for David was so beautiful, for the Lord, and then Solomon, did that, like, was the one to put it into practice, the temple, but so do you think that's something with that, like the mixing and the pride of doing it for mankind and not for the Lord? the difference in those two temples? Just curious what you thought.
Oh, you're completely right. There was the love and the wanting to please the Lord with Solomon and David, and Moses, of course, who built the tabernacle. So that's where their heart was to they were communing with the Lord, and the Lord was giving them the details of how to build it. So when they built the second temple, keep in mind it was not Herod that built the temple to begin with. It was another group, and when they were coming back, and they were wanting to focus on the Lord and having a place to worship. But Herod, he was doing this as a showcase of his magnificent reign. He was not a well liked from amongst the Jews. He was not well liked. So they have a lot of sayings if you read some of the stuff that they have to say about him. He was not popular at all with them, and he was doing this to try to please them and to please the Romans at the same time. And it had nothing to do, from what I can tell, nothing or very little to do with spiritual. There was the different focus, the completely different focus on the two. And that's why we see that. The other thing about that is keep in mind, we don't have the ark. The ark of the Lord was in the tabernacle and there with Solomon. Then it is disappeared. It's not there. So there is a different focus and on it. Yeah. So completely different area on that. And then my next question I've gotten was there any changes in the temple after Jesus did what he had done there? Not at first, but remember, within 70 years of his death, that it was destroyed. So no, not at first, but yes, it was destroyed again, and it hasn't been rebuilt since then. And the Sanhedrin and scribes, what kind of well, they would have been put into the salary thing that I talked about, and remember this the Sanhedrin. Oh, wait a minute, was it the Pharisees or Sanhedrin? I'm getting myself mixed up. But one of the groups, they actually were wealthy on their own, and they went to study in the temple on their own. So were they getting paid? Possibly, but usually their family supported them. Um, they didn't have to, that's where it comes a little difference. So were they getting paid? Possibly, yeah. Any other questions? Well, like I said, these were just examples of possible money amounts, but either way, there was a lot of different things. Um, there's a lot of money involved, and when there's a lot of money, it's very easy to have greed. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see the next temple be built, isn't it? Ah, um, and the question, you know what? We're going to have to, the next question I had was, do you think the temple being built is the third temple? Do you think it has any symbolic references? Number 3 is perfection in the spirit. Well, we do know that it's going to be defiled by the Antichrist. So I think that we know that it has to be built. The thing is that we also know that New Jerusalem will come, and we know that there's many more things, and this would be more of a revelation class that we talk about when we get into the Ezekiel temple and all of that. So I do think there's more to come, and probably there is some spiritual references to that. And yeah, there's a bunch of questions about the different royal families. And yes, I'm not going to get into all of those, but yes, there is definitely sometimes corruption and greed. We know that as well. When there's a vast amount of money, we go back to what we were talking about, the love of money. And when you go into the love of money, the love of power, and those can corrupt. And like I said, a little bit of greed, a little bit of corruption, it goes a long ways. It starts getting in there and seeping into it. So again, next week we're going to be looking at Purim, and we're going to be looking at how to celebrate Purim, what it is. And then on the 13th, if you'd like to celebrate, there is Purim coming up. So yay. And I will tell you, Purim is a month before Passover. So we're getting into the Passover season, and we'll be getting ready for some of that as well. So just kind of a heads up on what some of the next discussions will be about. But if there's anything you'd like to discuss, then please send it to me and I can do some research on it and see what I can come up with. The veil that was torn when Jesus died, it's Herod's temple. There was a veil, even though the ark wasn't in there, they still had the veil in there. And keep in mind, the veil, one of the things interesting about the veil is how thick it was. It's I can't remember how many hand breadths, but it's the width of a hand. You know how wide your hand is, so it was that thick, and it still tore. So that, yes, it was in Herod's temple that it ripped, but there was no ark in there. And is the One World Church a financial scam spearheaded? Yep, it probably will be. Okay. So good questions. Great questions, guys. I am going to go ahead and close it. I hope that you found it interesting. Keep in mind, my numbers are just estimates of what I could figure out based upon what I read. And I've never found anything that came like this. And this is why I thought it was interesting. The Lord had me start researching this because I've never looked at it at this angle before. So I hope you enjoyed it. And we're going to end in prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you so much. And if there was something that came out of alignment with you, please bring it to our attention so we can correct it. We only want to hear things of the way you do and see things the way you do. And this was an interesting way for us to look at it, Lord. It's something I've never looked at it that way before. So thank you so much for allowing us to learn about why was it considered greedy? Why was it a den of vipers? Thank you so much for all of that, Lord. Lord, thank you so much for allowing us to have the time to learn about your people. In your precious name, amen. Shalom, everyone. I will see you next Sunday. And again, we're going to be talking about Purim. Shalom.
Shalom.